Millions danced to the upbeat rhythm of "We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off," worshiping the singer as a straight romantic idol, preaching safe love during the terrifying peak of the AIDS epidemic. Yet, lying beneath the cold earth for 17 years was a nameless corpse without a headstone, ravaged by that exact same disease. That brutal reality belonged to William Jermaine Stewart. Record labels extracted millions by forcing a gay black man to bury his true identity alive. The artist whose voice taught the world about physical safety ultimately received a fatal HIV diagnosis. The second the corporate machine detected the virus, they severed his lifeline. They shredded his contracts and threw him out onto the street like a defective product. He took his last breath in 1997, surrounded by the absolute silence of the executives who had drained his talent. How does a commercial system use your voice to comfort the globe, only to mercilessly crush you into dust the moment you stop generating profit? Let's find out. William Jermaine Stewart was born on September 7, 1957, in Columbus, Ohio. The world he entered was firmly rooted in the working-class realities of the American Midwest. His parents, Eugene and Ethel Stewart, provided a foundational environment defined by the standard struggles and quiet dignities of mid-century life. Columbus in the late 1950s and 1960s was an industrial hub, a place where the rhythm of life was often dictated by factory shifts and the steady hum of a post-war economy. For a young black boy growing up in this setting, the avenues for extraordinary advancement were narrow, often requiring exceptional talent coupled with unrelenting drive. Within the Stewart household, music was a constant presence, a source of solace, celebration, and communal identity. It was here, in the unassuming neighborhoods of Ohio, that the earliest seeds of Stewart's artistic ambitions were planted, long before he understood the staggering complexities of the industry he would eventually conquer. The trajectory of Stewart's life experienced a seismic shift in 1972 when his family relocated to Chicago, Illinois. He was 15 years old, an impressionable teenager suddenly thrust into the sprawling, intense, and culturally magnificent landscape of one of America's most defining metropolises. Chicago is a city of stark contrasts, characterized by its towering architectural achievements and its deeply segregated, complex neighborhoods. For the Stewart family, the move was likely driven by the pursuit of better economic opportunities, a continuation of the broader historical currents that had long drawn black families to northern industrial centers. However, for young Jermaine, Chicago represented something entirely different, a vibrant, overwhelming sensory experience. The city's south and west sides were legendary incubators for gospel, blues, and an evolving, sophisticated brand of soul music. Navigating this new urban environment required resilience and a rapid adaptation to a world filled with both profound inspiration and immediate temptations. To survive the complex social dynamics of Chicago and to carve out a sense of belonging, Stewart anchored himself to the performing arts. Music and dance were not merely hobbies, they were currencies of respect and avenues of escape. The city's underground club scene and neighborhood block parties served as his informal conservatory. It was in these spaces that he meticulously honed his physical craft, learning to translate the pulsing rhythms of 1970s funk and soul into kinetic energy. He possessed a natural grace and an undeniable magnetism, traits that were essential for standing out in a city overflowing with talent. Dance became his armor and his voice. Through movement, he could assert his identity and command attention in a massive city that easily swallowed the unremarkable. This relentless dedication to his physical expression eventually led him to the doors of a cultural institution that would alter the course of his life and the landscape of American television. In the 1970s, Soul Train was far more than a syndicated music program. It was a televised weekly celebration of Black excellence, fashion, and musical innovation. Created by the visionary Don Cornelius in Chicago before eventually moving to Los Angeles, the show was the ultimate proving ground for aspiring dancers and artists. To secure a spot as a regular dancer on the Soul Train line was to achieve a profound level of cultural validation. Stewart, driven by a fierce ambition to transcend his circumstances, managed to infiltrate this highly competitive, electrifying arena. On the set of Soul Train, he was surrounded by peers who were equally hungry and exceptionally gifted. The environment was physically exhausting and psychologically demanding. Dancers were required to constantly invent new routines, maintain impeccable style, and project an aura of effortless cool under the glare of studio lights, all without the promise of significant financial compensation. Yet for Stewart, the show offered an invaluable education. He absorbed the mechanics of television production, observed how established musical guests commanded the cameras, and built a network of relationships within the industry's rising talent pool. Despite his success as a dancer, Stewart harbored a deep, unwavering desire to be a vocalist. His time on Soul Train positioned him closely to the architects of the era's R&B sounds. When the show's creator, Don Cornelius, and music promoter Dick Griffey conceived the idea to form a vocal group out of the program's most popular dancers, Stewart saw his definitive opportunity. The group, which would eventually become the enormously successful trio Shalamar, was holding auditions to find its core members. Stewart poured his ambition into securing the position of lead vocalist. However, the rigorous and highly subjective selection process yielded a devastating result. He was passed over, watching as his peers, including Jody Watley and Jeffrey Daniel, were elevated to the front line, securing the recording contracts and the ensuing fame that he so desperately craved. It was a profound early lesson in the harsh, often arbitrary realities of the entertainment business. Rather than allowing this rejection to extinguish his ambition, Stewart made a pragmatic and disciplined pivot. He swallowed the bitter disappointment of the Shalamar audition and leveraged his reputation as an elite dancer to secure employment as a background performer. He embarked on grueling national tours, providing the visual architecture for artists who stood in the spotlight he felt destined to occupy. The life of a background dancer in the late 1970s was devoid of glamour. It involved relentless travel schedules, modest pay, and the psychological challenge of pouring immense energy into performances where your name would never appear on the marquee. Yet Stewart approached this period not as a defeat, but as a rigorous apprenticeship. He studied the vocal techniques of the headliners, analyzed the crowd's reactions to specific musical arrangements, and developed a comprehensive understanding of stagecraft. He was learning how to build and sustain a performance from the ground up, quietly preparing himself for the moment when the industry would finally grant him the microphone. This period of silent, relentless grind eventually orchestrated a life-changing transatlantic connection. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the musical landscape was undergoing a significant evolution. The disco era was waning, and artists were searching for new sonic directions. London, in particular, was experiencing a vibrant cultural renaissance, blending the theatricality of the new romantic movement with the rhythmic foundations of American soul and R&B. Stewart's professional journey brought him to the United Kingdom, a move that placed him in the center of this innovative musical cross-pollination. It was here that he crossed paths with Mikey Craig, the bassist for the rapidly ascending British pop group Culture Club. Craig recognized a raw, undeniable potential in Stewart that extended far beyond his abilities as a dancer. The connection with Mikey Craig proved to be the catalyst Stewart had spent a decade working toward. Recognizing his vocal talent and his refined understanding of stage presence, Craig became a crucial advocate, helping Stewart navigate the complex corridors of the British and American music establishments. Through this association, Stewart was able to secure an introduction to the executives at Arista Records, a powerhouse label known for cultivating major pop and R&B acts. The audition that followed was the culmination of years of preparation, rejection, and unwavering persistence. He had evolved from a wide-eyed teenager in Chicago to a seasoned, battle-tested professional. When Arista Records presented him with a recording contract, it marked the triumphant end of his struggle for a platform. He had finally secured the opportunity to transition from the shadows of the background to the center of the stage, unaware that the very contract granting his lifelong wish would also construct the walls of an inescapable glittering confinement. The ink on the Arista Records contract did not merely signify a professional milestone for William Jermaine Stewart. It marked his immediate transition from an autonomous, striving artist into a meticulously managed corporate asset. In the early 1980s, signing with a major international record label was akin to entering a highly disciplined, multi-million-dollar manufacturing facility. Arista, under the formidable direction of its executive board, was renowned for its precision in identifying raw talent and packaging it for maximum demographic yield. For a newly signed artist, the initial phase of development was less about musical exploration and entirely focused on market positioning. The label's artists and repertoire, A&R divisions, public relations teams, and image consultants immediately descended upon Stewart, analyzing his physical attributes, his vocal timbre, and his background to construct a narrative that would resonate with the most lucrative segment of the record-buying public. The industry during this period was undergoing a massive visual revolution, largely driven by the advent of MTV and the increasing importance of music video television. An artist could no longer rely solely on the strength of a vocal performance. They had to embody a distinct, highly marketable visual archetype. For a black male solo artist entering the mainstream R&B and pop arenas at that specific historical juncture, the commercial pathways were strictly defined. The industry had cultivated a highly lucrative template built upon the legacy of earlier soul crooners, but updated for the glossy, synthesized-driven aesthetic of the 1980s. This template demanded the projection of an idealized, unthreatening, yet deeply alluring heterosexual masculinity. The target demographic was clear: young, predominantly female consumers who purchased records, concert tickets, and teen magazines based on the fantasy of the romantic lead. The infrastructure of the music business, from the radio programmers to the magazine editors, functioned synergistically to sell this specific fantasy. Stewart, possessing striking facial features, a dancer's physique, and a naturally charismatic disposition, was instantly slotted into this pre-existing mold. The machinery went to work on his exterior. He was styled in the defining fashion of the era, tailored suits, silk shirts unbuttoned to reveal his chest, and an ever-present, carefully calibrated smile. Album covers and promotional photographs were orchestrated not to capture his authentic essence, but to present a flawless, accessible heartthrob. However, beneath the carefully curated wardrobe and the manufactured press releases lay a profound and non-negotiable reality. William Jermaine Stewart was a gay man. In the cultural climate of the 1980s, and specifically within the conservative quarters of mainstream R&B, this fact was viewed not merely as a personal detail, but as an existential threat to commercial viability. The societal backdrop of the era was heavily marked by traditional gender norms and an overwhelming lack of mainstream LGBTQ plus visibility. To be an openly gay public figure in music was practically unheard of, and attempting to become one was widely considered an act of professional self-sabotage. The consequences of coming out or being outed were absolute. Immediate alienation of the core female fan base, withdrawal of radio support, and the swift termination of recording contracts. For Black artists, these pressures were often compounded by the complex intersections of race and cultural expectations regarding masculinity. The community and the specific musical genres he operated within had historically celebrated strong traditional patriarchal figures, leaving little to no space for sexual deviation from the established norm. Many biographers and music historians suggest that the executives and management teams surrounding Stewart were not naive to his reality. In the elite circles of the entertainment industry, sexual orientation was often an open secret, discussed behind closed doors, but fiercely guarded from the public eye. The arrangement was an unspoken but rigid contract. The label would provide the funding, the promotion, and the platform, but in return, the artist had to surrender their right to public authenticity. Stewart was essentially placed into a glass cage, visible to millions, but entirely isolated from his own truth. He was required to actively participate in the construction of his own false narrative. Media training sessions prepared him to answer questions about his ideal woman, to flirt harmlessly with female television hosts, and to project a romantic availability that was entirely fictitious. Every interview became a tightrope walk, requiring a constant, exhausting vigilance to ensure the mask never slipped. The psychological burden of this daily performance was immense. Living a compartmentalized life meant that Stewart's truest self was constantly relegated to the shadows, treated as a dangerous secret that had to be contained at all costs. The dichotomy between his soaring public success and his private reality created a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. During the day, he was surrounded by stylists, managers, and screaming fans, celebrated for an image that he knew was fundamentally incomplete. At night, he retreated into a hidden world, navigating the underground social spheres of the gay community with a constant underlying paranoia. The 1980s marked the rise of an increasingly aggressive tabloid journalism culture, particularly in the United Kingdom, where he had first found his footing, and the fear of being targeted by the press was a relentless source of anxiety. Paparazzi and gossip columnists actively sought to dismantle the pristine images constructed by public relations firms, and exposing a closeted heartthrob was considered a highly lucrative journalistic prize. This environment of fear and suppression profoundly impacted his ability to form and maintain genuine personal relationships. The very nature of his fame required that any authentic romantic partnership be hidden from view, denied the basic dignities of public acknowledgement. He could not walk down the street, attend an industry gala, or celebrate his monumental career achievements with the people he truly loved, unless they were disguised as assistants, bodyguards, or distant friends. The isolation inherent in this dynamic was crushing. As he prepared to launch his debut album, The Word Is Out, in 1984, the irony of the title was likely not lost on him. He was standing on the precipice of global stardom, armed with infectious dance tracks and the full backing of a corporate titan, yet he was bound by a vow of silence regarding the most fundamental aspect of his humanity. The stage was set for a triumphant arrival, but the man stepping into the spotlight was already carrying the heavy invisible armor required to survive the very success he had sought. As his debut record began to gain traction, the demands of the promotional circuit intensified. The daily itinerary of a rising pop star in the mid-1980s was a grueling marathon of radio station visits, television tapings, and international flights. In every city, in every studio, Stewart was required to deploy the lover man persona with unwavering consistency. He learned to navigate the intrusive questions of journalists with practiced deflection, offering charming anecdotes that satisfied the media's appetite without revealing a single genuine detail about his private life. Those within his inner circle during this period noted the staggering emotional stamina required to sustain this illusion. The energy it took to constantly self-monitor, to police his own mannerisms, his speech patterns, and his associations was a secondary, hidden career in itself. The industry had demanded a product, and Stewart delivered it flawlessly. But the human cost of this transaction was beginning to quietly accrue. The success of his early singles validated the label's marketing strategy, solidifying the belief that the manufactured image was the key to his profitability. The more records he sold to young women, the tighter the grip of his public relations strategy became. The commercial validation acted as a reinforcement of his confinement. To break the illusion now would not only betray the label's investment, but also risk disappointing the very audience that had elevated him. He was trapped by his own achievements. The upbeat, infectious nature of his early music provided a stark, almost cruel contrast to the internal vigilance he was forced to maintain. He was providing the world with a soundtrack for uninhibited joy and carefree romance, while his own existence was defined by meticulous calculation and a deep-seated fear of exposure. As the decade progressed and his star continued to rise, this fragile equilibrium between public triumph and private suppression would be subjected to unimaginable historical pressures, transforming his silent struggle from a matter of career preservation into a literal fight for survival. The transition from a moderately successful debut to a defining, era-encapsulating breakthrough is a notoriously difficult threshold to cross in the recording industry. For William Jermaine Stewart, the years following his initial solo release were marked by an intense, strategic recalibration. The objective set forth by his management and label executives was clear: to transcend the boundaries of the specialized R&B charts and achieve pervasive global mainstream dominance. This required a meticulous refinement of his sonic architecture and a further solidifying of his carefully constructed public image. As the mid-1980s approached, the musical landscape was heavily dominated by a polished, synthesizer-driven pop soul aesthetic. To capture this lucrative market, Stewart was paired with the formidable production talents of Narada Michael Walden and Preston Glass, architects of some of the decade's most enduring pop anthems. Together, they entered the recording studio to craft the album that would forever define Stewart's legacy, a project titled Frantic Romantic. The studio environment during these sessions was characterized by an exacting pursuit of commercial perfection, where every vocal inflection, drum machine pattern, and synthesizer flourish was calculated to maximize radio airplay. Stewart, ever the disciplined professional, delivered vocal performances that were energetic, charismatic, and flawlessly aligned with the label's vision. The centerpiece of this strategic effort was a track that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off. Released in the spring of 1986, the song was a masterclass in commercial pop R&B construction. Driven by a relentlessly upbeat tempo, a bright brass section, and an infectious sing-along chorus, the record was engineered to be an inescapable presence on radio dials and dance floors. The lyrical premise, a charming, seemingly innocent proposition to slow down the pace of a romantic encounter and focus on emotional connection rather than immediate physical intimacy, was a stroke of marketing genius. It arrived at a precise moment of cultural anxiety. The sexual liberation and hedonism that had characterized the 1970s and early 1980s were being rapidly replaced by a growing, pervasive public apprehension. In this shifting climate, Stewart's anthem was embraced as a catchy, reassuring message of temperance. It provided the MTV generation with a socially acceptable, highly danceable manifesto of safe romance. The commercial response was staggering. The single skyrocketed up the Billboard Hot 100, reaching the top 5 in the United States and achieving similar dominance across Europe. Overnight, Stewart was elevated from a rising talent to an international pop phenomenon, gracing magazine covers, appearing on premier television broadcasts, and embarking on lucrative global tours. Yet, beneath the platinum records, the sold-out arenas, and the relentless media promotion, We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off harbored a profound, deeply concealed resonance. While millions of listeners engage with the song as a straightforward pop diversion, cultural historians and musicologists have subsequently analyzed the track as a poignant, coded confession. For Stewart, the lyrics resonated on a frequency entirely detached from the manufactured heartthrob image he was contractually obligated to project. As a closeted gay man navigating the increasingly perilous landscape of the mid-1980s, the concept of taking our clothes off extended far beyond the realm of casual romantic pacing. It represented the terrifying threshold of physical vulnerability, exposure, and potentially lethal risk. The song's plea to simply hang out and converse or have a glass of cherry wine, can be understood not merely as a gentlemanly deferral, but as an expression of a profound, suppressed yearning for safe, unburdened human connection in an era where physical intimacy for gay men had become fraught with existential danger. To fully grasp the psychological weight resting upon Stewart during his zenith, one must examine the devastating historical backdrop of 1986. The United States, and indeed the global community, was in the grips of the emerging acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS epidemic. What had begun years earlier as a terrifying unnamed medical anomaly within specific urban populations had metastasized into a full-scale public health crisis. During these crucial middle years of the decade, the medical understanding of the virus was still evolving, treatments were virtually non-existent, and the diagnosis was universally recognized as a terminal outcome. The public reaction was characterized by widespread panic, heavily fueled by misinformation and deeply entrenched societal prejudice. Because the virus disproportionately affected the LGBTQ+ community in its early stages, the disease became inextricably linked with homosexuality in the public consciousness. This association triggered a wave of intense, often vicious stigmatization. Political leadership remained largely silent, and mainstream media frequently utilized fear-mongering rhetoric. For the gay community, it was a period of unimaginable grief, as individuals watched their peers, partners, and friends succumb to a mysterious illness while facing profound hostility from the broader society. It was within this crucible of fear and tragedy that Jermaine Stewart was mandated to maintain his position as a universal symbol of carefree heterosexual romance. The commercial infrastructure surrounding him responded to the national health crisis by enforcing an even stricter adherence to his sanitized, idealized public persona. The music industry, entirely dependent on public goodwill and corporate sponsorships, was terrified of any association with the epidemic or the controversies surrounding it. Consequently, the glass cage in which Stewart resided became a fortress. He was surrounded by an apparatus designed to insulate his brand from the grim realities of the era. However, no amount of public relations maneuvering could protect him from the internal devastation of his circumstances. Many within his private sphere have reflected on the excruciating duality of his existence during this time. He was a man who intimately understood the terror sweeping through his community, who privately mourned the devastating losses occurring in the shadows, yet was required to step onto brightly lit stages every night to perform an anthem of safety for an audience largely oblivious to his true reality. Every time he stepped into the spotlight, he was forced to perform a triumphant lie, actively burying his private truth to keep the corporate machinery turning. One can only imagine the profound isolation experienced during the height of the frantic romantic promotional cycle. Stewart would perform to thousands of screaming admirers, executing flawless choreography and flashing his trademark smile, embodying the absolute pinnacle of commercial success. He was the focus of intense adulation, yet he remained fundamentally unseen. Following the thunderous applause and the backstage photo opportunities, he would retreat to the solitary confines of luxury hotel rooms, enveloped by a silence that stood in stark contrast to the noise of his public life. He was trapped in a paradox. His voice was everywhere, but he possessed no platform to speak his own truth. The very song that had granted him financial security and global recognition also served as a daily inescapable reminder of the profound compromises he had been forced to make. He was celebrated for articulating a cautious approach to love, while simultaneously being denied the fundamental human right to love openly and authentically. As the decade moved forward, the emotional and psychological toll of this relentless performance began to compound. The sheer stamina required to constantly monitor his behavior, to evade probing journalistic inquiries, and to suppress his authentic self was an unsustainable burden. While the public saw a polished, energetic pop star at the absolute height of his powers, the internal reality was one of a man navigating a complex web of fear, grief, and isolation. The industry demanded that he remain a static, flawless product, an eternal romantic ideal frozen in time. But human beings are not products, and the continuous suppression of a core identity inevitably creates deep psychological fissures. Stewart utilized his undeniable talent, his professional discipline, and his charismatic presence as protective armor against a world that he knew would reject his true self. However, as the shadows of the epidemic grew longer and the demands of his fame remained unyielding, the weight of that armor became increasingly difficult to bear. The unprecedented global success of We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off and the frantic romantic album firmly established William Jermaine Stewart within the upper echelons of the mid-1980s pop music hierarchy. However, in the highly volatile ecosystem of the recording industry, a massive breakthrough is rarely a moment of enduring respite. Rather, it is the ringing of a bell signaling the commencement of an even more grueling and high-stakes marathon. The pressure to replicate and ideally surpass the commercial yield of a platinum-selling record is an immense burden that falls squarely onto the shoulders of the artist. As the calendar turned from 1986 into 1987, the executives at Arista Records were already orchestrating the next phase of his career. The mandate was uncompromising: maintain the momentum, retain the lucrative demographic of young female listeners, and solidify his status as a premier international heartthrob. To execute this, the machinery of the label demanded that Stewart re-enter the studio, effectively denying him the necessary time to decompress from a physically and emotionally exhausting global promotional tour. The ensuing project, his third studio album titled Say It Again, was released in 1988. From a production standpoint, the record was a calculated effort to mature his sound slightly, while retaining the heavily synthesized, dance-oriented architecture that had secured his previous success. The title track, Say It Again, proved to be a formidable transatlantic hit, demonstrating his enduring appeal and his undeniable vocal prowess. The accompanying music videos and promotional photography for this era showcased an even more polished, deliberately stylized version of the artist. The wardrobe became sharper, the choreography more aggressive, and the marketing narrative leaned even more heavily into his positioning as a romantic leading man. Yet the historical and cultural context surrounding this release had grown significantly darker and more complex since his previous album. The late 1980s were not merely a continuation of the decade's earlier anxieties. They represented the absolute nadir of the public health crisis. The AIDS epidemic had escalated into a devastating, pervasive reality, casting a long, inescapable shadow over the entertainment industry and society at large. During this specific period, the atmosphere within the music business, particularly for artists navigating the intersections of pop, R&B, and dance music, was characterized by an intense unspoken paranoia. Record labels, hyper-aware of the conservative political climate and the reactionary tendencies of mainstream media, instituted an environment of stringent self-censorship. There was a palpable fear that any association with the marginalized communities most affected by the crisis could trigger a catastrophic commercial backlash. For Stewart, the surveillance over his public image and private associations escalated into total control. He was required to project an aura of vibrant, invincible health and unabashed heterosexuality at a time when he was privately bearing witness to the decimation of his own community. Biographers and cultural historians note that the psychological dissonance required to operate under these conditions was staggering. To maintain his career, Stewart had to actively suppress his grief, his fear, and his fundamental identity, adopting a persona of carefree romanticism while standing at the epicenter of a historic tragedy. The profound isolation of this experience cannot be overstated. Fame, by its very nature, creates a barrier between the artist and the public, but for a closeted star during the height of the epidemic, that barrier was impenetrable. Stewart was surrounded by an entourage of professionals, managers, publicists, stylists, and bodyguards, whose primary objective was the protection and monetization of his image, not the nurturing of his psychological well-being. Genuine, unmonitored human connection became increasingly difficult to secure. The private spheres, where he might have once found solace and community, were now fraught with anxiety, overshadowed by the constant threat of tabloid exposure. The British and American gutter press were relentlessly pursuing the hidden lives of celebrities, utilizing aggressive and often unethical tactics to uncover secrets that could destroy careers. In this predatory environment, every personal interaction carried a massive, potentially fatal professional risk. The psychological toll of this hypervigilance began to manifest beneath the surface. While the public saw a consummately professional entertainer hitting his marks and delivering flawless vocal performances, the internal reality was one of a man enduring a prolonged, agonizing state of emotional siege. Simultaneously, the foundational landscape of mainstream music was undergoing a rapid and seismic shift. As the 1980s drew to a close, the polished, optimistic pop soul that had defined Stewart's greatest triumphs was beginning to lose its commercial dominance. A new, harder-edged sonic aesthetic was emerging from the urban centers of America, pioneered by visionary producers like Teddy Riley. This new subgenre, known as New Jack Swing, aggressively fused the melodic structures of R&B with the aggressive, syncopated drum programming and street-level attitude of hip-hop. This was not merely a change in instrumentation. It represented a fundamental shift in the cultural presentation of the black male artist. The industry's required archetype pivoted sharply away from the sophisticated, approachable heartthrob and toward a much more rugged, overtly hyper-masculine and street-oriented persona. Artists who successfully navigated this transition were rewarded with massive cultural relevance and record sales, while those who remained tethered to the conventions of the mid-'80s found themselves rapidly marginalized by radio programmers and younger audiences. This shifting tectonic plate within the industry presented a profound, perhaps insurmountable challenge for Stewart. His entire brand, carefully curated over 3 albums, was diametrically opposed to the gritty, hip-hop inflected masculinity now demanded by the marketplace. When he released his 4th studio album, What Becomes a Legend, most in late 1989, the disconnect between the artist and the prevailing cultural zeitgeist was starkly apparent. Despite featuring strong vocal performances and contributions from top-tier producers, the album struggled to gain significant traction. The lead singles failed to penetrate the upper reaches of the charts that he had dominated just a few years prior. The sophisticated pop sheen of the record felt out of step with an audience that was currently embracing a much more aggressive, bass-heavy sound. For an artist whose sense of worth and security had been deeply intertwined with his commercial viability, this plateau was undoubtedly alarming. The reaction of the corporate machinery to this decline was swift and unsentimental. The recording industry operates on a strict, pragmatic calculus. Resources are allocated based on current yield and projected growth. As the sales figures for What Becomes a Legend most failed to meet internal projections, the label's enthusiasm began to noticeably cool. The massive promotional budgets, the extensive international tour support, and the meticulous attention from top executives, the very elements that had engineered his initial rise, were gradually withdrawn. The industry was already turning its gaze and its capital toward the next generation of artists who naturally embodied the emerging New Jack Swing aesthetic. Stewart found himself caught in a devastating professional limbo. He was no longer the priority, yet he remained bound by the restrictive terms of his contract and the suffocating image he had been forced to maintain. He was aging out of the teen idol demographic, but the industry offered no clear pathway for a pop-oriented, closeted black artist to transition into mature, sustainable artistry during that specific era. The compounding pressures of this period, the fading commercial momentum, the alienation from a shifting musical landscape, and the unbearable silent weight of surviving an era defined by a terrifying health crisis, began to exact a severe physical and emotional toll. Maintaining the facade required an expenditure of energy that was simply unsustainable over a prolonged period. Those who observed him closely during the transitional years between the late 1980s and the dawn of the 1990s noted a change in his demeanor. The effortless charisma that had defined his early career often appeared strained, replaced by a deep underlying exhaustion. The relentless travel, the late nights, and the profound stress of living a double life in a hostile climate wore heavily on his constitution. He was a man fighting a multi-front war entirely on his own, battling to remain relevant in a fickle industry, fighting to protect his private truth from a predatory media, and silently enduring the collective trauma ravaging his community. As he prepared to enter the 1990s, the glittering armor that had shielded him and confined him was beginning to fracture, setting the stage for a private crisis that the corporate world was entirely unequipped and ultimately unwilling to navigate. The dawn of the 1990s presented William Jermaine Stewart with a critical juncture, requiring a strategic navigation of both a rapidly evolving musical landscape and a shifting professional foundation. Following the disappointing commercial performance of his late 1980s releases, His tenure with Arista Records, the label that had engineered his ascent to global stardom, came to a quiet conclusion. In the recording industry, such transitions are pivotal. They can either signal the twilight of a career or the genesis of a mature reinvention. Stewart, possessing an unrelenting work ethic and a profound dedication to his craft, actively pursued the latter. He secured a new recording contract with Reprise Records, a prestigious subsidiary of the Warner Music Group. This new partnership was intended to be a stabilizing force, providing the institutional backing necessary to reintroduce him to a market that had recently favored harder street-oriented sounds. He immediately entered the studio to begin work on his fifth album, a project poignantly titled Set Me Free. The recording sessions for this album represented a concerted effort to modernize his sonic profile while retaining the core vocal charisma that remained his strongest asset. There was a palpable sense of renewed purpose, a belief that he could successfully transition from a 1980s teen idol into a respected, enduring figure in adult contemporary R&B. However, as the preliminary tracks for Set Me Free were being laid down in 1991, Stewart was confronted with a private devastation that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his life and career. He received a positive diagnosis for the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. To fully comprehend the gravity of this diagnosis, it is essential to contextualize the medical and social realities of the early 1990s. This period predated the development and widespread availability of highly active antiretroviral therapy, HAART, the combination of protease inhibitors that would eventually transform HIV from a fatal diagnosis into a manageable chronic condition later in the decade. In 1991, an HIV diagnosis was uniformly recognized by the medical community as a terminal progression toward AIDS. The life expectancy following diagnosis was often measured in mere months or a few short years, characterized by a steady, agonizing physical decline and susceptibility to severe opportunistic infections. Beyond the grim medical prognosis, the social stigma attached to the virus remained at its absolute zenith. Public fear was rampant, political rhetoric was frequently hostile, and the disease was still heavily inaccurately associated by the broader public exclusively with moral failing and marginalized communities. For a public figure operating within the mainstream entertainment sector, the diagnosis carried an immediate dual sentence, a biological ticking clock, and the threat of total professional ruin. Stewart was suddenly forced to navigate a terrifying reality. The meticulous energy he had previously expended to conceal his sexual orientation now had to be redirected toward hiding a life-threatening illness from a highly observant, deeply integrated network of industry professionals. The infrastructure of pop stardom requires intense physical proximity to a vast array of personnel, makeup artists, wardrobe stylists, choreographers, and tour managers. Attempting to disguise the early physical manifestations of the virus, such as unexplained weight loss, chronic fatigue, and dermatological changes, from this intimate circle required an excruciating daily vigilance. He was attempting to record an album and prepare for a promotional cycle while silently enduring profound medical anxiety and the onset of physical vulnerability. As the physical realities of his condition became increasingly difficult to camouflage, the institutional response from the recording industry began to crystallize. The corporate infrastructure of a major record label operates on strict risk assessment models and fiduciary priorities. An artist is fundamentally an investment requiring significant capital outlay for production, marketing, and distribution. When executives at Reprise Records became aware of Stewart's declining health, whether through direct disclosure or via the inevitable channels of industry communication, their reaction was entirely dictated by standard, pragmatic commercial protocols. The label recognized that the massive promotional apparatus required to launch a new album could not be sustained by an artist whose health was compromised. A national tour, extensive press junkets, and the rigorous demands of music video production were no longer viable. Furthermore, the label's marketing departments likely determined that the public revelation of his illness would irreconcilably damage the carefully curated, approachable image they intended to sell. The label's reaction was swift and clinical. In 1991, Reprise Records permanently shelved the Set Me Free project. The album, which represented Stewart's creative labor and his hope for professional renewal, was locked in the corporate vaults, never to see commercial release during his lifetime. Subsequently, his recording contract was terminated. This severance was not framed as a punitive measure, but rather as a standard execution of contractual clauses related to an artist's ability to fulfill promotional obligations. Yet the practical effect on Stewart was catastrophic. In an instant, the vast institutional support system that had defined his adult life was dismantled. The financial advances ceased, the public relations shield evaporated, and the access to elite industry resources was entirely revoked. He was stripped of the protective apparatus of stardom at the precise moment he was most vulnerable. The broader entertainment ecosystem mirrored this institutional withdrawal. The radio stations that had heavily relied on his upbeat anthems to drive their ratings in the mid-1980s quietly removed his back catalog from their primary rotations. The music press, always focused on the immediate present and the emerging trends, simply moved past him. There were no industry-sponsored health initiatives, no solidarity concerts organized by the mainstream R&B community, and no public statements of support from the corporate entities that had previously generated millions of dollars from his likeness. The silence surrounding his sudden departure from the public eye was profound. It underscored a harsh historical reality regarding the conditional nature of celebrity within the commercial sector. An artist is only protected and amplified as long as they remain a functional, flawless component of the profit-generating machinery. Once that functionality is compromised, the erasure is immediate. William Jermaine Stewart was left to face a terminal diagnosis entirely outside the fortified walls of the industry he had dedicated his life to. The severance of his professional identity compounded the physical trauma of the disease, plunging him into an era of deep involuntary obscurity. He transitioned from being a globally recognized, heavily managed commodity to a private citizen battling a highly stigmatized illness in a society that offered minimal compassion. The glamorous facade of his 1980s peak had been entirely stripped away, leaving only the stark, harrowing reality of a man fighting for his life, forced to navigate the final, most difficult chapter of his journey in profound and absolute isolation. The abrupt severance from the recording industry necessitated a profound geographical and psychological relocation for William Jermaine Stewart. Stripped of his recording contract, his promotional support, and the demanding itinerary of an international pop star, he retreated from the coastal entertainment capitals of Los Angeles and London. He sought refuge in Homewood, Illinois, a quiet, unassuming suburb situated just south of the Chicago city limits. This relocation represented a poignant return to the geographic roots of his youth, though the circumstances of his homecoming were starkly tragic. Homewood offered an environment entirely detached from the relentless scrutiny and the manufactured glamour of the music business. The transition from performing in sold-out arenas illuminated by stadium lighting and enveloped by the deafening sound of public adulation to the profound silence of a suburban residence marked the beginning of his final, most private chapter. Here, devoid of the corporate machinery that had dictated his existence for over a decade, Stewart was forced to confront the unvarnished reality of his declining health without the protective barrier of celebrity. The physical and emotional crucible of his final years was directly tied to the grim medical landscape of the mid-1990s regarding HIV and AIDS. This period is historically recognized as one of the most agonizing eras of the epidemic, situated tragically just before the widespread introduction of highly active antiretroviral therapy, HAART. In late 1996 and 1997, the medical breakthrough that would eventually alter the mortality rate of the virus. For Stewart, managing the disease involved enduring a grueling regimen of early, highly toxic medications that often carried severe, debilitating side effects, yet offered limited efficacy in halting the progression of the virus. The physical toll on a man who had built his career and identity upon kinetic energy, elite dance choreography, and an image of flawless vitality was devastating. The virus systematically compromised his immune system, leaving him vulnerable to a cascade of opportunistic infections. The meticulous physical maintenance that had been a requirement of his stardom was replaced by the arduous daily labor of simply surviving. Biographers note that he faced this physical deterioration with a quiet dignity, fiercely guarding his privacy and refusing to allow the tabloid media to document his decline. During this period of profound isolation, the contrast between his physical reality and his enduring cultural footprint was deeply jarring. Even as he remained out of the public eye, his greatest commercial triumphs continued to resonate across global airwaves. Radio stations, oblivious or indifferent to his private struggles, continued to program his upbeat anthems as nostalgic reflections of a bygone decade. Millions of listeners continued to dance to the vibrant energy of his recorded voice, entirely unaware that the man behind the microphone was fighting a terminal illness in absolute obscurity. This phenomenon highlights the inherent cruelty of the commercial pop apparatus. The recorded product achieves a form of immortality, remaining perpetually youthful and vibrant, while the human architect of that sound is left to endure the fragile, finite realities of mortality alone. Stewart was forced to listen to the echoes of his own manufactured peak while being systematically erased by the industry that had profited from it. As his condition worsened, the complications associated with late-stage AIDS began to overwhelm his system. The specific manifestation of his illness ultimately culminated in severe liver cancer, a brutal consequence of a body weakened by prolonged immune deficiency. The medical interventions available to him in the final months were largely palliative, focused on pain management rather than curative hope. On March 17, 1997, William Jermaine Stewart passed away in Homewood, Illinois. He was 39 years old. His death occurred at the very precipice of the medical revolution that might have saved his life, adding a layer of profound historical tragedy to his passing. The man who had provided the definitive soundtrack for an era of caution had ultimately fallen victim to the era's most devastating scourge. The reaction, or rather, the lack thereof, from the broader entertainment industry following his death was a chilling testament to his conditional status within the corporate hierarchy. In an industry known for its grandiose memorials, posthumous tributes, and the rapid re-release of catalog material following an artist's passing, the silence surrounding Stewart was absolute. There were no televised retrospectives on major music networks, no full-page commemorative advertisements purchased by his former record labels, and no organized acknowledgement from the executives who had previously orchestrated his career. The corporate entities that had successfully monetized his youth, his talent, and his carefully curated image offered no public recognition of his humanity or his demise. He was treated not as a fallen artist of significant historical impact, but as a liability that had already been written off the ledger. This institutional indifference manifested most tragically in the physical circumstances of his burial. Following his death, the immense financial resources he had generated during his peak had largely evaporated, depleted by years of medical expenses, the loss of his recording contracts, and the cessation of touring revenue. Consequently, the internationally recognized pop star was laid to rest in Homewood Memorial Gardens without a headstone. The absence of a grave marker was not an uncommon occurrence for victims of the AIDS epidemic during that era. It was frequently the result of a devastating combination of financial ruin and the enduring profound social stigma that led families and institutions to bury the deceased in quiet anonymity. For 17 years, the burial site of William Jermaine Stewart remained an unmarked plot of earth. It stood as the ultimate heartbreaking symbol of his complete erasure. A man who had been viewed by millions was left entirely nameless in death. The profound injustice of this unmarked grave persisted for nearly 2 decades, mirroring society's slow, agonizing journey toward understanding and destigmatizing the AIDS crisis. It was not until 2014 that the silence was finally broken. The resolution did not come from a repentant record label or a wealthy music executive attempting to correct a historical wrong. Instead, it was initiated by the grassroots dedication of an anonymous fan who, upon discovering the location and condition of the grave, privately funded the creation and installation of a proper headstone. This quiet act of restorative justice provided Stewart with the fundamental dignity that the commercial machinery had denied him. The headstone finally marked his physical resting place, but more importantly, it signaled a broader cultural willingness to look back at the casualties of the 1980s with empathy rather than fear. Today, the legacy of William Jermaine Stewart demands a rigorous and compassionate re-evaluation. When modern audiences, equipped with the context of history, listen to his vibrant catalog, the experience transcends mere nostalgia. The upbeat synthesized tracks are no longer viewed simply as disposable pop commodities. They are recognized as the enduring coded confessions of a man navigating an impossible set of circumstances. His music is a historical document capturing the intersection of immense talent, rigid commercial mandates, and the terror of a global health crisis. Stewart's life serves as a stark, enduring indictment of an industry that demands absolute authenticity in the vocal booth while enforcing absolute suppression in the artist's private life. He gave the world an enduring, joyous soundtrack of love and preservation, serving as a beacon for millions, while being tragically denied the fundamental right to exist wholly and safely within his own truth. His story is a permanent, indelible scar on the history of modern music, ensuring that the true cost of the era's glittering illusions will never be forgotten.